What do you think would happen if you had an individual who only read garbage, right? Only took in garbage, and then had an opportunity to speak based on that knowledge, based on that garbage? Well, as you might guess, garbage is what comes out. And Toby Sumpter has done a magnificent job of displaying that he has very limited knowledge, but speaks very confidently in that limited knowledge. And he's a victim of the people he surrounds himself with because he has been imbibing, you know, misinformation for so long. He has no idea that when he speaks, he utters forth nonsense. Okay, so I'm coming on pretty strong, but then again, Toby Sumpter's known for being, bringing it strong himself, right? I want to take a look at Toby Sumpter's opening for this particular debate, the theistic evolution debate between himself and Redeemed Zoomer, who's defending the theistic evolution viewpoint. Don't recommend the debate. You're not going to learn anything about theistic evolution other than, if you want to take in some garbage so that you can spit out some garbage, then maybe yes, watch this video. But otherwise, it's not really worth it. But what Toby Sumpter has done for us is he has posted on his blog his opening salvo, right? His opening statement, and so we're going to take a look at that opening statement. And before we get to that, let's just say a few things about Toby Sumpter, like why am I paying attention to this, and why am I paying attention to this, and why should I care? I have written about Toby Sumpter and his crew. He is a pastor of a church in Moscow, Idaho, underneath the umbrella of a denomination called the CRC, which is led by Doug Wilson, the grand poobah of this white nationalist, Christian nationalist group. I've made no small amount of effort to say that I believe they're a cult-like group within, Protestant Christianity. And I've written several blog posts here. Toby Sumpter gave a big talk at the conference that they hosted for their denomination at Ken Ham's Ark Park. And I've talked about the ignorance of Doug Wilson, who's the leader of this. And we're going to run into Doug Wilson's brother, in Toby Sumpter's opening statement. And then we also have what I'm think is the most important is I think that Toby Sumpter doesn't know any science, and I think he kind of understands that he doesn't know science, so he is relying on a source, and of course that's the problem. His source is highly suspect and therefore has fed him garbage, and that's why he is speaking garbage in this statement. But my bigger concern, which I'm not going to address in this particular video, but you can read it at my blog, A Plea for Gospel Clarity, Addressing the Errors of Doug Wilson's Theology, which would also be Toby Sumpter's theology. I think they have huge theological problems, which are much greater than and much more important than his scientific errors. But we're just going to stick to the science story here. I've also done a video about Toby Sumpter in the past. So if you wanted to get a little bit more background about Toby Sumpter and sort of what he's like, and I reviewed one of his social media posts, which was a very cryptic thing, which I could have explored what the meaning of it is, but I think the meaning's kind of clear if you understand his sort of Christian nationalist or white nationalist, tendencies. Probably more than a tendency at this point. All right, so with that, let's get cracking. Let's look at Toby Sumpter's opening statement of this theistic evolution debate. So here's the blog of Toby Sumpter, Having Two Legs. I would note that it's also important to have a brain. It's nice to have two legs, but having a brain would also be helpful. Yes, I am going to be kind of sarcastic in this video. It's just like this group is known for their sarcasm, all right? And so they have to understand they're going to get a little bit back. All right, the theistic evolution virus. And the word virus here is very important because he's going to liken this to one of his favorite, things to talk about, which is his existential angst about the COVID pandemic. All right, so he can't help but sprinkle that into everything that everything he talks about. But we'll get to that. And as he notes, he did this online debate, and here's a revised version of his opening statement. I heard his opening statement is very similar to this in the actual video. So I'm not going to read every word of this. I'm going to pull out some highlights here. But we will begin at the beginning. While I do believe that theistic evolution is not compatible with biblical Christianity, I want to say at the outset that I do not believe that this means that no one who holds to theistic evolution can be saved. I believe there are many sincere Christians who have erroneously believed that God used macroevolution. Macroevolution is going to be a really important word that we're going to need to define in a few minutes to create everything that has come into existence. And many of them are in heaven now, and they now know better, of course. They know the truth. The truth that I know that I'm going to be bringing you in this blog post. At the same time, by saying that theistic evolution is not compatible with biblical Christianity is to say it is inconsistent with Scripture and reason, and therefore ultimately unhelpful, antagonistic, and long-term utterly cancerous and destructive to the Christian faith. All right, it's a cancer and destructive Christian faith. But there are many Christians who do believe it and are in heaven. And yes, I'm talking about Francis Collins. Of course, like I said before, he cannot resist poking on these types of things. Hey, let's start out by defining terms. I agree. It's really nice to have to have him spell out what he thinks these terms mean. Right? That's going to help us, I think, understand what what is in his mind. I want to define terms a little before proceeding. I'm here arguing against theistic macroevolution. So this is what he thinks he's arguing against in this debate. Theistic macroevolution. So what exactly is theistic macroevolution? It's the idea that God in some way providentially superintended, so it's usually a way of saying God is using the laws that operate the functioning of the universe, right? Are the providential laws, the way that God maintains how he holds molecules together, right? And how they interact with one another. Those rules or those laws that God established in creation, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In some way, those rules and laws, those rules and laws superintended, governed the addition of new or novel traits, what he calls neomorphs, right? New physical manifestations, right? New characteristics within a population when the ancestors neither had those traits nor the genetic information to code them. Now, this is in quotes because, as he says here I'm quoting Dr. Gordon Wilson's definition. I will be drawing heavily from his work on the scientific side of things going forward and throughout this debate, and recommends one of his books to us. So who is Gordon Wilson? Gordon Wilson is a professor at New St. Andrews College, or maybe it's university now, out in Idaho. And he is essentially professor of natural sciences. Because they don't really have many science degrees. He's just sort of like natural sciences, philosophy of science. And most notably, he is the brother of Doug Wilson, who is the grand poobah of that denomination, right? All right, so Gordon Wilson has written a number of books. He's made a video. He's a very devoted young earth creationist. And Gordon Wilson draws heavily upon the young earth creationist literature, and all of his work is heavily laden with young earth creationist sort of typical tropes and bits of misinformation. And Gordon Wilson, seems to, let's put it on the spectrum of young earth creationist. He's very articulate, but also completely misunderstands many, basic concepts in especially in evolutionary biology, and therefore misrepresents them. He basically let's put it this way, he trusts his sources, which are other young earth creationists. So he has learned from young earth creationism, not necessarily having learned from like deep study of the topics himself and come to these conclusions. He's very much been led by other young earth creationists that way. So what we have here is we have young earth creationists writing a lot of literature that contains a lot of misinformation, misconceptions, that has fed the brain of Gordon Wilson, who has then repackaged that and added his own, exaggerations, all right, on some topics. And then he becomes the primary source for Toby Sumpter, right? Because basically he's working right there. He's going to the same church, right? He becomes a trusted source for Toby Sumpter. But this trusted source has left him sorely unprepared to really be able to discuss this topic. So going back really quickly to his definition of macroevolution, I think that Gordon Wilson, or really probably Toby Sumpter, really does see, and we'll see this a little bit later, that he thinks that organisms have, information, right? The information they've been created with a certain amount of information, and that information then limits what they can make. Yes, every single individual, you're born with a certain genes and variations of those genes, and that definitely does limit what you can do. There's only so many things I can do. Like my muscles can only get so large. I can only grow so tall. I can only process food in a certain way, right? Because of that. And that's going to be true for every individual, which means it's also true for a population, except for within a population, there could be variation, right? Some individuals could grow taller and some might not grow as tall, right? And so when you have variation in populations, the question is how much variation there is. And he's sort of saying no, but even a population's limited. It only has so much variation, right? But, then there's also mutations, right? And he's saying that there aren't any new novel traits, right? Is he saying there aren't ever any new variations in genes? No, because now he's going to say that microevolution does happen. He's going to say that mutations do occur, that mutations do create variations, but those variations aren't very important. But he's completely missing the idea that, or dogs don't just suddenly sprout feathers, all right? Elephants don't suddenly just have wings. I mean, you don't have that kind of new variation. You have modifications of themes, right? Modifications of the information that's there already. If you have a modification of a variant that exists, well, it's a new variant, which actually is new information, right? It says you can do something that your ancestor could not do, but it's not going to be dramatic. I can make new feathers. What I can do is I can make a little bit longer fingernail, right? It gives me the ability to dig better. And then my descendants might have longer fingernails, right? Because I've changed the regulatory genes that allow me to develop fingernails faster and maybe thicker. Right. And then I can develop muscles that are a little bit stronger around those fingers, right? And those fingernails, right? So eventually I'm going to have talons, right? It's and at some point I'm going to have, maybe I have retractable claws. Now when I say I don't mean necessarily human beings. I'm just talking about you can think of any organism that you want. And in the long run, over a long period of time, you can go from having little tiny wimpy fingernails to giant talons that can, come down and grasp your dog out of your yard, right? Right. And strangle it, right? That's a new morphological feature, right? With a different function than the function of those original fingernails. Does that happen there was an individual in this population that was born with giant talons? Nope, not going to happen. All right. It was a series of many small steps, many different mutations that affect the genes themselves, which may affect the muscle structure or the characteristics of the keratin itself, but also mutations that affect gene regulation, such that it turns genes on for longer or expresses them more, expresses them less in certain situations, allowing for the development of other features. And you would never get all of those different changes occurring in any one individual at one moment in time, right? But what you can do is you can accumulate those changes through populations, right? Replacing themselves over many generations and develop a brand new trait like that. Now, I suspect that Gordon Wilson and Toby Sumpter are going to be like, yeah, okay, that can happen. We're going to call that microevolution. But what if an organism does microevolution and changes its fingernails into talons and then has tusks and grows bony nations off of their heads, which kind of like ossicles on a giraffe, and then their ears get twice as long, and then they have muscles that be able to turn them in different directions like an owl. And I mean, let's talk about 100 different traits of an organism and have them all change into something that has a different function than they had before, right? Just through that series of small steps. And pretty soon you got a cat instead of a dog. Now, dogs are not evolving into cats. That's a misconception, again, of the history of life, that anyone would expect a cat to be evolving into a dog or a dog into a cat, right? What I am saying, though, is that you could take a dog and in the future, it could have a lot of different features such that it doesn't look like a dog anymore, right? It'd be a different kind of organism. And you wouldn't have to do that through any point in that timeline of looking at and watching that organism over generations. You would never say, oh, wow, that thing just changed into something completely different. But that's the expectation. That's kind of what Toby Sumpter thinks that evolutionists are proposing, is that an organism just suddenly looks like a different organism and they suddenly develop new features. All right, spending too much time on this, but although I'm just giving you a preview of the rest of what we're going to look at here. All right, no one denies. So macroevolution, hey, you can't get new information. All right, that's wrong. Go to this channel and search for novel genetic traits and their origins, and I go over a bunch of different examples of brand new genes, like the origin of new genes, and where new genes come from, producing new functions that didn't exist in that population before that time. No one denies the reality of microevolution. Okay, so now, but what is microevolution? Did you know that microevolution, like in my class, if I talk about microevolution and macroevolution, which I generally don't like to use those terms because most evolutionary biologists don't like the term microevolution or macroevolution because they don't really think there's a true distinction there. There are evolutionary textbooks that just don't even use those terms, right, at all. But say we have to use those terms. All right, the definition of microevolution is changes within populations. Right? It's the changes in variation, the allele frequencies within populations. Right? That's microevolution, small scale change within species, right? Within populations. Macroevolution is always defined, right? It's always defined as when a population divides and becomes different enough that you'd have to become a different species. Right? The act of becoming two separate species that no longer have the characteristics of a single species, that is the ability to interchange, mix genes and alleles, right? The loss of compatibility. That's one definition of a species. We don't want to go down the whole trail of all the different variations there. But the gist of it is that all evolutionary textbooks, theorists would say that macroevolution is the pattern of speciation, right, above the population level, right? Once you have made new species, that now we're calling that macroevolution, which is just an expression of a larger expression of a lot of microevolution happening that then divides a population such that it loses contact with itself, all right? Then you've reached the macro stage of evolution, of change. You've changed enough that you are identified as a different species. But that is not what Gordon Wilson and what Toby Sumpter are calling microevolution, right? Microevolution is the rearrangement, redistribution, removal, and remodeling of existent genetic information in various kinds of creatures. Various kinds of creatures. Now, if you said within species, I would have been like, that's great. That's a very good, that's a decent overview of microevolution. Rearranging, because we have crossing over and we rearrange our chromosomes. Redistribution, right? You pass on, chromosome from your mom or from your dad to your offspring, right? And they get a different combination as a result, especially with sexual reproduction. And redistribution, okay, that's redistribution. Removal, yes, alleles are lost from individuals. Alleles are lost from populations over time. Remodeling of existing genetic information. What does he mean by remodeling? I'm not real sure here. Remodeling can be mutations, right? It's like, hey, I've got this strand of A, T, C's, and G's, and I had some mistakes made in it, and that causes a slight different variation. So now I have like, a different, it folds into a slightly different pattern, and it reflects light differently. So that creates a different color, right, in this hair than was there before. Well, that would be a mutation. That creates a new variant, a new trait. Right. So, but that's fine. All that happens within populations. But now he doesn't say populations. He says in various kinds of creatures. So now, and kinds is in quotation marks, right? What exactly is a kind? This was designed by God to allow for families and kinds of creatures to adapt to different environments. For families and kinds. That's confusing. That's confusing. If you've watched any of my other videos, you know that we've talked a lot about what young earth creationists believe are kinds. So the Ken Ham kind of viewish of kinds is like approximately at the family level, right? When I say cats and dogs, I really mean felines and canines. And so for Ken Ham, all canines, foxes, African wild dogs, coyotes, wolves, your domesticated dogs, they're all canines and they're all part of the same kind of organism. And here you'd say God designed a kind to adapt. So he's saying that God created all the canines as one kind of organism, which is why there's only 2 canines on the ark that then all became all the different species we have today. Ooh, you see what I just did there? Right? You started with 2 canines on the ark, and then those 2 canines became 35 different living species that are around today, plus 100 other extinct species. And all those species are different from one another, right? Because when we identify them as being different, they're different species. Right? That's macroevolution. Right? That's a tremendous amount of macroevolution that has occurred. Right? But Toby Sumpter is not recognizing that as macroevolution. He's calling that microevolution. This is what young earth creationists do. They redefine these terms, and they act like, well, this isn't evolution. This isn't theistic macroevolution, because this is just microevolution. I'm sorry, it's evolution, right? It's macroevolution. You need to say you don't believe in some macroevolution, but you do believe in some macroevolution. Okay, you really do. All right, but okay, so what's confusing about saying families and kinds? All right, wait. So does God create a family of things? Like maybe carnivores are a family? Does he? I don't know what he thinks a family is. That's very confusing, because if a kind is equivalent to a family, then why say families and kinds? Right? I don't know if he's saying like, oh, a family might be like carnivores, and then there's different kinds of carnivores. There's canines, there's felines, there's bears, there's seals, right? There's muskrats, there's a bunch of different canines, there's hyenas. Those are all kinds, and God created those individual kinds separately from one another. We classify them we classify them in order, but maybe Toby Sumpter thinks they're all one big family. And he created them to adapt to different environments. So yeah, he's saying like, yeah, they can rearrange their material, they can reorganize it, they can remove information, but they can also, what was the word there? Remodel. And they can have mutations that actually create new characteristics, new traits that allow them to adapt to a changing environment. Because after all, Toby Sumpter believes the original world was very different than today's world, which means the organisms have to have changed, all right, from their original state to what they are today. And how have they done that? They didn't do that by miraculously like changing overnight in a population. They changed gradually, although they had to change gradually really fast after the flood, which can certainly include a wide variety of physical traits. Compare a Russell Terrier with a Bernese Mountain Dog. Okay. It's like classic. Go to domesticated dogs to show variation. That's because He, and I think like so many people, they just look at external traits and they're wowed by like the size difference in a domesticated dog and the different coats, right? And different behaviors, and think that this is an amazing amount of physical variation. Except that, those two dogs are not that much different than my sister and I am. They're very genetically, they're very, very, very similar to each other. Domesticated dogs are all incredibly similar to each other in terms of total amount of genetic diversity. What they have is they have a few genes that have been highly selected to create really dramatically different looks to them. Right? I mean, if Toby Sumpter thinks, that a Bernese Mountain Dog and a Russell Terrier are that different, then he should, why does he think that cats and dogs couldn't have a common ancestor? Why couldn't God have created a cat dog? Right? And then it just had variation that allowed it to adapt into cats and dogs. Right? For that matter, why not just all carnivores? Why not just have a common carnivore like created? Maybe that's what he means by family. Maybe God created a family of things that had like genetic the information for a carnivore, and then allowed that to adapt into dogs and cats and hyenas and bears and seals. But no true neomorph has come into existence in that great variation. No true neomorph. No true what? No true new feature? He thinks that all those features in domesticated dogs were part of wolves. And yes, most of them were. But you know what? Domesticated dogs do have traits that wolves don't have. They do. They have traits that wolves don't have. They have mutations that aren't in the wolf population that give them characteristics that make them really appealing to us. Right? We've mutated their development. We've mutated their ears. We've mutated their sense of smell. We've changed a lot of features of domesticated dogs. Right? He's looking for something bigger than that. He's looking for, we've got it right here. Size, shape, color, hair length, numerous other details shift and change. Yeah, well, you could shift and change all the features of a dog and have a cat, right? Why not? Are they what feature about a cat and a dog are so radically different that you couldn't just call them size, shape, color, hair length, claw length, being able to purr, not be able to purr? Not all cats could purr. So tell me a characteristic that would exclude those two from just being the same thing. Right? Why couldn't you change one into the other based on this definition of microevolution? Because remember, this definition of microevolution is actually macroevolution. But no dog has ever grown feathers or a turtle shell or sprouted a trunk. See, this is what he thinks macroevolution is. No dog has ever grown feathers. So he thinks feathers would be a neomorph, a truly new characteristic. Right? The thing is, like for all carnivores, what is a new feature of any carnivore? What's a truly unique, in his mind, like something that is so complicated, a completely different new organ, right? That doesn't exist in any other animals. What is that new feature of carnivores? Let's go back. Yeah, what is that? What is that a new feature of And then if you don't like the carnivore thing, what about rats? What about rodents? Is there any new feature that any rodent has that is truly novel, or is it all just an adaptation on the general core of the genes that it has? Because Toby Sumpter is admitting you can have variation in the genes, right? And they can create adaptions. That adaptation can occur. So where's he going to stop that adaptation? Yeah, of course. No dog is sprouting feathers. No turtle is, no dog is going to sprout a turtle shell. Right? And I'm not going to sprout a giant trunk. I guess he's thinking giraffes. But if you have an animal like an okapi. All right, we're not making much progress here, so let's step it up. And despite Darwin's great hope in the fossil record, nothing has turned up. I guess what he means is that there is no transition fossils. But if he were to actually understand anything about evolutionary theory and the way populations adapt, he should understand you're not going to expect to see like a dog with feathers, right? You're not going to see some like weird amalgamation of characteristics. Every generation is going to have continuity with the next. It's very true. Like begets like, right? Kinds produce kinds. Kinds always produce kinds. There's no kind of organism. There's no species of organism that gives birth to a completely different kind of organism. They give birth to individuals that are very similar, the same kind of organism. And those then give birth to other organisms that are very similar to them, right? But they're always changing a little bit. Just like I'm sure Toby Sumpter recognizes that, a giraffe today doesn't look like an animal that God created, right? If you're walking in the garden, you didn't see Adam didn't see giraffes, right? I mean, they're sometimes depicted that way, but they're no giraffes, and so they've changed. They've changed a lot. Did one just suddenly was there an animal that gave birth to a giraffe such that you looked at the one animal, you went like, oh, that's not a giraffe. And then, whoa, its offspring is completely different. I got to give it a different name and all. It's a completely different type of organism. I mean, it's an ungulate still, but but it's completely different now. No, that doesn't happen. Nobody's saying that happens. It is just like the Bible says. One kind produces another. Remember, the biblical authors are in a world in which there's tons of myths about bizarro organisms and organisms that give rise to like crazy new types of things that you couldn't trust that one thing would remain the same. And the biblical authors assuring you, no, the way God has made the world, it's the providential rules, right? Right? In God's providence, way up here, his providential superintending of the world, he has made it such that weird things like that don't happen. It's consistent. You can expect that a wolf is going to give rise to more wolves. But 100,000 years from now, that wolf might not be the same as this wolf. They might look really different. But each generation, you're not going to know the difference. You're not going to see that change. All right, so back to, so there isn't any transition fossils. No, the fossil record is full of billions of transition fossils. Every organism alive today is a transition organism. There is no way that 10,000 years from now that the organisms 10,000 years from now will be identical to the ones today. They will have changed. And you follow another species long enough, it's going to change. And you're not going to see the day that it suddenly changes. All right, so I'm not going to deal with the scriptural case that he's going to make here. But of course, he's going to do the usual thing. All right, theistic evolution requires for violence and death and destruction and so forth. I will go down to where he does sort of the classic, the Bible proves that death started with Adam. And which I've never really understood why this is so compelling to him and others. Wherefore, as by one man's sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed on to all man, for that they all have sinned. Right? That's compelling evidence that Adam's died because of his sin, and that his descendants died because of their sins. This doesn't say anything about death coming into the world for all other organisms. Likewise, for the wages of sin is death. My dogs don't sin. The death of men and animals did not happen until man sinned. He immediately just jumps to like, okay, these are proof texts. That's not, that is going beyond what the text says. Going well beyond what the text says. I think these have just been repeated so many times that everyone just assumes. I mean, it's just like an assumption. Oh, that's what it believes. That's is what it means. The failed scientific theory. Theistic evolution is also repugnant to reason and science. And is an attempt to salvage a completely failed scientific theory. That's not a failed theory if it explains the observations of the world around us. And evolutionary theory, even those who say evolution is not true because they hold to an interpretation of the Bible which would reject the time for evolution to even happen, right? Will say that, well, evolutionary theory does provide a compelling explanation for the observations of this world, right? They just choose not to believe that that's how God actually did it. Just like you could say that, stellar theory or stellar evolution of how, a sun forms and how it goes through stages and then eventually turns to supernova. It's a very compelling argument from just like a mechanistic standpoint, understanding how matter interacts with each other. And it's obvious that it takes a long time to go through all those things, much longer than the age of the universe, according to Toby Sumpter. And so therefore, Toby Sumpter doesn't believe that that's how the certain stars have formed. But it wouldn't be right to say that that is a completely failed scientific theory. It's an utterly reasonable scientific theory. And it can be completely reasonable and you can still reject it. So failed scientific theory is to not understand evolutionary theory at all, right? All right, so how is it repugnant to reason and science? Let's find out one of the first ways that it's completely unreasonable. Theistic evolution contradicts reason and science, beginning with its flagrant disregard of the second law of thermodynamics, or entropy, which states that things in nature tend to move from order to disorder. Things tend to dissipate energy. Okay? Energy spreads out, becomes less useful over time. There's a long discussion we could have about entropy and some of the misconceptions about entropy, but we'll accept this general description of entropy here. It's like, even most young Earth creationists don't use the entropy argument anymore. I mean, this is a failed argument of young Earth creationism. Right? Does he really, really think that the second law of thermodynamics completely excludes evolutionary theory? Right? I mean, how is Toby Sumpter alive today? I mean, he's defying entropy, right? I mean, at least until he dies. Right now, he's defying entropy, which is using energy, all right, to maintain order. Right? And as long as you have energy input, you can maintain order. And you can build order out of disorder. I mean, what do plants do? They take in carbon dioxide and water, right? Really simple molecules. And they're fusing them together. And they're making complex features. Right? As long as there's an energy source, as long as the sun is shining, all right, matter can be organized into more complex, right? And as soon as energy is no longer available, those things will decay. I mean, the law of entropy takes over, right? That energy is going to dissipate, right, and be spread out. But it can be pulled together. And so Toby might be thinking about the origin of life or something like that, but he's not talking about evolutionary theory, about how organisms adapt and change, how a primitive carnivore with simple carnivorous traits could become cats and could become dogs, right? There's nothing about the second law of dynamics that's going to defy that as a possibility, right? So this is the contradiction of reason and science, is that the flagrant disregard for the second law of thermodynamics, as if like, scientists don't know anything about the second law of thermodynamics and they just completely ignore this. They just like put their fingers in their ears like, no. Second law of thermodynamics tells us this can't be true, but we believe it anyway. This is just a silly, really silly argument. There's no Big Bang, even set off by God, can give us zebras, solar eclipses, and J.S. Bach. Right? Now, yes. Yeah, I mean, he is thinking about the origin of life. He's not saying that you can't have a single cell become a more complex cell. And of course, that is what he's thinking. He is thinking of like where does all the genetic information come from? Right? He's talking about origin of life issue. He's not talking about if I had the very first mammal-like creature, could I make all the other types of mammals from that? There would be nothing that would deny second law of thermodynamics in that. And can I have animals that have more chromosomes than they have now? Yes. Can I have animals that have twice the size of genome than the original mammal? Absolutely. And Toby Sumpter believes that. He doesn't know he believes it, but there are families, right? There are kinds of organisms that one of their adaptations is they have duplicated their chromosomes, and therefore they have twice as much genetic material, and they have adapted some of those copies of genes to do other functions. And therefore, and they've done all that in spite of second law of thermodynamics, right? In the face of the second law of thermodynamics, they have enlarged their genome, derived new traits, and become different types of organisms, right? Which one could argue, according to his definition, are more complicated, are more complex than their ancestors. And they did that despite the second law of thermodynamics. Right? Now, if he wants to push that all the way back to the origin of life and talk about like the origin of the original tiny bits of information that started some process off, I mean, you can go make that argument, but that's not really an argument against theistic evolution. Not only is this true in general, it's also true in particular with regard to information. Nothing in the world naturally goes from no information to some additional information by itself. So as I was just saying, so if you start with some information, I think would he agree that you could add information? Right? He's saying if you have no information, you start out with nothing. You can't make something from nothing. I mean, okay, yeah, you can't make the universe from nothing. But, is that really an argument against, evolution of cats and dogs from a common ancestor? Or birds from dinosaurs? I mean, dinosaurs have a whole bunch of information, right? They have a giant genetic code. And in that genetic code, they have information for making all the parts of dinosaurs. And if you modify those parts, you could make a bird out of it, right? And so changes in those parts, swapping those parts around, adding new ways to use those parts in combinations that aren't used before, and actually creating new genes, right? Duplicating genes and then using those new genes for new processes. You're going to change one organism into another type of organism, and it's not going to have anything to do with the second law of thermodynamics, right? Second law of thermodynamics cannot stop that from happening. Give the universe billions of years, and the ocean will not carve an exquisite sandcastle on the beach of Fiji. This is just the design argument. Right? This is just a repackaged design argument. Oh, look, leave an old IBM computer buried in a landfill and give it billions of years, and it will not become a MacBook Pro or an AI supercomputer. These are ludicrous assertions of evolution. Okay, I agree. Those are ludicrous assertions. Absolutely ludicrous assertions of evolution, except that I don't know anyone who understands evolution that says that is an assertion of evolution. No one's saying that a bunch of pieces lying around are going to self-assemble in that way. All right. No one's saying that is how assembly works. A ancestor to a cat and a dog is a living organism, right? Lived in a particular environment, had features that allowed it to survive in that particular environment. There was a population of them. That population, let's say, it lived over an entire continent. And on one side of the continent, the conditions were different and they adapted, right? They had minor changes that added up eventually to two different species, one on one side of the continent, one on the other side of the continent. All right. And those species then underwent additional changes, right? They shifted their genes around. They recombined. They had mutations. They duplicated some of their genes. They created a few novel genes from spacers in between genes. In other words, there's information between genes. There's hundreds of thousands of base pairs that aren't being used in all organisms. And sometimes those pieces of information can become useful in the sense of like performing a greater function than just filling the space between two genes. Right. And then after many generations, those two different organisms are developing, slightly different, different behaviors. They're developing different ears and slightly different abilities to hear, and their smell is going to be a little bit different, right? Their claws are a little bit different. Their hair is a little bit different. All the things that Toby Sumpter talked about, earlier on, is just being like, well, these are just variations that allow organisms to adapt, right? And they can change them around and shift them around. Well, yes, but if you consistently shift them around in different packages that are isolated from each other and keep adding on new features, pretty soon you have a cat and you have a dog sort of type of kind. And Ken Hammond agrees that you could take just two things that are canine-like, and those things can then become foxes and wolves and coyotes and African wild dogs without defying the second law of thermodynamics. And how do they do it? Let's see, natural selection, mutations, gene flow or lack of gene flow, right? And genetic drift. Those four different features, those four different mechanisms shaped and shifted those populations into completely different species with characteristics that are adapted to those particular environments. Right? Where does Toby Sumpter find the inability for a common ancestor of really all the carnivores to make all those features? None of those features are like a massive new organ. Now you might be wondering, well, where did new organs come from then? But nobody says that there's a blind mammal that has no eyes, and then all of a sudden they have an offspring that has functioning eyeballs. Right? That again, that's not how evolutionary works. A functioning eyeball is a really complicated feature, kind of like an AI supercomputer, right? But even an AI supercomputer wasn't like, we didn't have like no knowledge of computers and then somebody just built a supercomputer. And so it was there, and the next day there was a supercomputer. No, there's been a long, I don't like to use the evolution analogy with technology because it really doesn't work, because technology does not produce offspring with variation. Right? That's a very different way of changing. But nonetheless, technology doesn't just suddenly appear. It can make pretty large transitions at times, much larger than organisms can. Natural selection mutations only account for the rearrangement, redistribution, removal, and remodeling of existing genetic information. Yeah, okay. Like I said before, if you start out with a basic mammal, go down to the fossil record and find the very first, like if you go up the fossil record, where's the very first time you see something that kind of like has mammal-like features? Got to have the right kind of inner ear bones. Looks like it forms hair, had hair, right? There's certain other anatomical traits that are characteristic of all mammals, right? Go find that animal. It's a small radish-like looking thing, right? It's a fairly small organism, probably nocturnal, right? And look at its genome. Its genome's probably like 1 billion base pairs, right? You've got 3 billion base pairs. Other animals have 10 billion base pairs. Actually, other animals have hundreds of billion base pairs, much larger in our genomes. But for mammals, right, we're all kind of consistent, right? Couple billion base pairs. So go back to that original mammal and then ask yourself, what incredibly novel feature couldn't have changed through just what he just said here? Natural selection mutations account for rearrangement, redistribution, removal, and remodeling of existing genetic information. So you have some original genetic information in that original mammal. What would prevent that genetic information from making all the different mammals that you see today? Like, what feature in any mammal today do you look at and you go like, wait a second, that is a irreducibly complex trait that had to have been made just for that particular species or kind and couldn't have come from that original pool of genetic information, right? Because we're just modifying that genetic information, right? And modifications include, young earth creationists have admitted to me this many, many times, because I've pointed out What about gene duplications? We have a gene that duplicates, and now you have two genes doing the same function, and then one of them has mutations that allows it to do a different function. So now you create, like, I can now smell three different things instead of one. And they'll say, like, that's just changes in genetic, that's just modifying information, right? You just copied information and then you mutate that information. So now you have multiple genes. They're doing multiple different things, but originally it all came from the same information. So they won't admit that's new information. They'll say that's modified information. Now you've lost the game as soon as you say that, because of exactly what I'm telling you right now. Right? What I'm telling Toby Sumpter is, like, he can't say that you could have a mammal with a basic mammal blueprint plan, right? A generic mammal. And say, like, okay, now we can allow that to become all the different types of mammals. Nope. But he is saying that, remember, he is saying that evolution is repugnant to reason and science. And it's a failed scientific theory. But isn't the evolution of all mammals from a common ancestor mammal, isn't that evolution? Isn't that macroevolution? That's common descent from a common ancestor. It's changing into many, many different kinds that can't reproduce with one another. But they've all come from the same common pool of genetic information, and you've just modified it. Right? Is that truly repugnant and failed? It's a failed theory. I need him to show me that can't happen, because that's what he's saying, is it can't happen. Okay. It's going to get worse here. Natural selection and mutations account for rearrangement removal. Okay. Yeah. As Cornell University professor John Stanford has demonstrated through his groundbreaking work in genetics. Yeah. John Stanford has done some work with genetics, but not on evolutionary biology, not evolutionary genetics. Right. His knowledge in this area is very limited. Listening to John Stanford, he has profound misconceptions about genome evolution specifically. Genetic mutation has never been demonstrated to mutate in a truly new and beneficial way. Completely false statement. I'm sure Toby Sumpter believes this, and he's been told this many times, and that's why I'm saying he's been fed a bunch of junk, right? He's been fed garbage like this. And he doesn't know how incredibly wrong he is, right? Absolutely, mutations have resulted in beneficial mutations. Now, he's throwing in the word truly because that's what Gordon Wilson would have used. And this is a catchword to sort of like cover yourself. Truly beneficial. Because, yeah, every mutation is a deterioration. Well, I guess if you just want to define mutations as deterioration, but that's just defining it that way. But that's not how mutations would be defined. Mutation is just a change, right? Whether the change is good, bad, or neutral is determined by the environment. That's true. There isn't any universal beneficial mutation. There is nothing. There is no mutation that is universally beneficial to all organisms, to all life, right? Because, this mutation allows me to breathe oxygen better. Well, what if you live in an environment that doesn't use oxygen? You don't need oxygen. That mutation makes you less efficient. I mean, it's no good for you. It's at best neutral. It could be negative. You might be doing a lot of work trying to, get oxygen there is no oxygen available. So, it's all relative to a local situation, to individuals and populations. There are absolutely beneficial mutations in populations. Absolutely. I personally like floppy ears. Personally, I kind of like floppy ears in dogs. That's a mutation. It's beneficial to the dogs that have floppy ears because people like them, take care of them, and it gives them better survival. Those floppy-eared dogs are surviving pretty well. There's a lot of offspring, a whole lot of offspring. We help them have offspring. They're very successful. It's a beneficial mutation to them. If I threw them out in the wild, they'd probably get more ear infections, and that would not be beneficial. But they're not in the wild, right? It's context dependent. If I was in outer space, most of my genes would be useless to me. Like they are bad. God made all of my genes, right? And if he put me in a different location, or I put myself in a different location, those would be bad mutations. I mean, even Adam and Eve, if you just threw them out into space, I don't think that they were made to survive there, which means their genes are bad, right? Those genes are terrible genes. You can't survive in space. No, it's totally context dependent. That's what good is, all right? It's not perfect. It's good. Good because of your environment. That's a statement on what he said theologically earlier, which I didn't go over. Okay. Mutations are always deteriorations, even if some fraction of them happen to aid in survival. Well, I mean, if they aid in survival, that is beneficial, right? He's defining it as like, well, whatever God made is the original version, and therefore any mutation that changes what God made is a deterioration. Even if it makes the organism better, right? It's a deterioration. Well, in that way, I'll just go right back to it. Let's say you have an original carnivore type, and it has its original genome that God gave it, right? Let's say that's what God created. God created the original carnivore. And Adam named it carnivore, right? And then from there, it reorganized its genome, which apparently is okay, all right? But it remodeled it. It had mutations. Well, Toby Sumpter would say like every one of those is a deterioration, right? Because it's not the original sequence they had. They're not the original ATCs and Gs they had. However, all of those things allowed that original carnivore to become bears and cats and hyenas and dogs. And even within each of those groups, they even became subspecialized into different things. Right? I've got my saber-toothed cats, and I've got my lions, and I have my house cats, and I have my pumas, and I've got my cheetahs and all that. So right, and all those there have amazing adaptations to their particular environments, but all of them include hundreds of thousands, if not millions upon millions, of changes from the original set, the original code, right? Those are all deteriorations, except that all those deteriorations made amazing creatures. It's like they made amazing things. So, okay, all right, let's call them deteriorations. If that's your definition. The definition is just they're a deterioration of the original information. Well, you could start out with a single cell and deteriorate it into millions of different life forms by that definition. That single cell had an original genome, and then that original genome copied itself, duplicated parts of it, had mutations, gained new functions from those mutations, right? And it all started with one piece of information that was perfect somehow, or the original code, and everything about it deteriorated, except that it deteriorated into amazing diversity. I know Toby's thinking like, yeah, but mutations, like most of them are bad and they would kill the organism, and you're deteriorating. And like, look, Sanford and so forth, like genetic entropy, like mutations are occurring and they're destroying organisms. They're destroying the original information. Heck yes, lots of mutations are very destructive. But in a populations of hundreds of thousands, the individuals that have mutations that don't destroy them survive and give their beneficial mutations to their offspring. Now, that's a simplified form. There's a lot of complicated genetic stuff going on there. And we'd have to talk about all the nuances of that. But in essence, that's what's going on, right? Natural selection is a force that since animals walked off the ark, right, in Toby Sumpter's model, and they had lots of offspring, right, they've been having mutations. They've been reorganizing. And lots of those mutations, lots of those reorganizations were not very useful, right? And those organisms didn't survive very well, right? But they did have successful offspring, which then passed on their genes, and then they changed and shifted and so forth. They became 35 different species of canines, all of which have amazing design for their particular environments. But that's all been sculpted through this process of decay of their genomes. Right? John Sanford is just plain wrong about genetic entropy destroying species. It's a real thing that some species are degrading and losing genetic information and their ability to adapt to their environments. After all, billions of species have gone extinct, right? But they've left survivors who are very, very well adapted to life today and are no less in no poorer shape than organisms from millions of years ago. Right? They're just as well adapted today as organisms were in the past. Darwin's great hope in the fossil record has been a colossal disappointment. And then he goes on and talks about Stephen Jay Gould. I mean, this is past history. This is a complicated thing with Gould. All of that's been pretty much sorted out. Gould was right in some ways. He was wrong in some ways. Sumpter does not understand punctuated equilibrium, doesn't truly understand what is going on there. He thinks that it's sort of supporting this idea of like that organisms have to make these giant shifts. Punctuated equilibrium is not about an organism suddenly, making feathers. That kind of punctuation, right? The punctuations are much smaller than I think what he imagines. That's because they don't exist. There aren't any missing links, as I already pointed out. Like every organism is, in a sense, a missing link. That's because all families of creatures were spoken into existence by the word of God, with nothing as distinct supernatural acts. Right? All families of creatures. He's not saying all species. He's saying all, again, I don't know, carnivores or all birds. All cats, all dogs, or the original dog kind, right? But where are the missing links between, yeah, I know we've been going on a long time here, and I've made this point before, but if Toby Sumpter is listening to this, I would challenge him to show me the links between a coyote and a wolf, right? Show me the link between them. I mean, they're distinct organisms, species. Show me all the intermediate steps between those two, right? They exist, or they did exist, but I don't know of any fossils that are like, the missing link. Show me the missing links between a lion and a cheetah. You believe they have a common ancestor, right? So unless you believe that there was a cat that gave birth to a lion and a cheetah, like, the two offspring grew up and one was a lion and one was a cheetah, which genetically is a ridiculous proposition that you could separate that much genetic variation into viable packages like that are that distinct. Okay. That would just that is out of the realm of anything we know about genetics. Right. Because if you don't believe that, and you believe that they gave rise to some variants, right, that then had offspring that had more variance, more mixing, more reshuffling, and eventually you got to those two, well, then there should be intermediates between all of them, right? Where are they? Show them to me. Where are they? I would say that we do have some of those. We have a few fossils that have interesting features between the two. But Toby Sumpter, and according to Gordon Wilson and others, they would look at all those and they would say oh, that's not a missing link. That's the actual living organism that was its own species. And it's true. That was an organism that was its own species. Okay. But it's also a missing link. Except, well, I guess it's not missing if we know about it. But that's what I'm saying. We do know about a lot of missing links. Every fossil in the fossil record is a link between itself and its descendants, unless it had no descendants, which it's possible some of our fossils were like, you had no descendants. And you know what? Actually, that's likely. A lot of organisms are killed before they ever reproduced, in which case they have no descendants. They're not a link to anything. But as a representative of their species, yes, they're most likely a link between that and something else. Okay, we gotta wrap this thing up. And finally, theistic evolution is offensive to biblical Christianity because it's repugnant to reason, defies fundamental laws of science. I'm still looking for the fundamental law of science that would say that evolution can't happen, especially since he believes in a ton of microevolution. right? He believes that evolution's happening, and is trying to prop up a theory that even his own advocates admit lack evidence. Didn't make much of a case for that. Okay, now here it comes. Here comes his real beef. Here comes the thing that is his real driver. Right? I'll leave you with, he doesn't care anything about the science of evolution, or he cares to understand it all because he thinks he understands it because he understands it from this philosophical sort of side of things. I'll leave you with one additional thought. We are living in the culture and scientific fallout of evolutionary science. Right? While a distinctively Christian worldview has managed to persist in bits and pieces, in other words, in our little enclave here in Idaho, and they have churches in a wide variety of places, but in our small denomination, we have managed to preserve a distinctly Christian worldview. All right, little parts of it. Right, we own the real thing here. The rest of society only has little bits and pieces. This culture is the fruit of evolutionary science. This outside culture. All right. And if that weren't enough, we just emerged from several years of scientific and medical madness in the COVID scam. Yeah. Playing God in labs with gain of function research. Oh boy, you know who he's talking about there, right? As if he knows what gain of function research is at all. Again, garbage in, garbage out. He's read a ton of garbage on this particular topic. People who have fed him amazing sounding information for which he has no ability to actually judge. Mass hysteria over bad flu virus to the experimental vaccines and all the demands to trust the experts and follow the science. The scientific community has utterly beclowned itself. Right? This is him. This is Toby Sumpter. He's a machine of moral outrage. The sane scientific establishment has been predicting catastrophic rising sea levels and melted polar ice caps. Well, I don't know if he's checked lately, but yes, the sea levels are rising and the ice caps are melting. Has been soberly insisting that we evolved from catfish. Who says we evolved from catfish? Like, please show me, Toby. Where are we saying we evolved from catfish? Yes, there's this talk about a fish to amphibian transition, but by you saying catfish, you expose your fundamental misunderstanding of that whole transition. All right. Catfish are a very modern species, and no one is saying a catfish could ever become, all right, that's certainly not in today's environment, right, could evolve to live on land. All right. That is not the type of fish that that any evolutionary biologist has ever suggested has become an amphibian. I'm grateful for antibiotics and good vaccines. Now, here's code words. You might think you're reading this, you're thinking like, oh, well, he is saying that vaccines are good. He's not a vaccine denial person, even though he just said that he called into question the new vaccines, right? Good vaccines. This is always code word for, whatever vaccine you're talking about, I can say is a bad vaccine. That hasn't been tested enough. It causes this. It's that we haven't done enough research on that, right? And so any vaccine you don't like, you simply call a bad vaccine, but you still say, "Oh, I'm all for the good vaccine." The evolution is a mind virus in our cultural system, and theistic evolution is a particularly virulent strain. Yeah, I've heard Gordon Wilson talk, and one time I had read some of his stuff. I thought he does have some interesting thoughts that are creative within the young Earth creationist world. And then I heard him doing an interview at the Fight, Laugh, Feast thing at the Ark Encounter. And I realized, wow, he really doesn't understand biology. I mean, and he's a biologist, right? He's a PhD biologist, but he does not understand evolutionary theory at all. It could be he understands it, but he also is just a politician. and he knows the catchphrases to use. The thing is, if he's not actually teaching Toby Sumpter, like, okay, well, this is really what they believe, but we're going to use this catchphrase because this is really great for a, you know, for a debate, and you can win your point and sound, you know, like you've defeated the other side. Okay, except that's not about the truth, and Toby Sumpter likes to think he's all about the truth. But he's got a tremendous amount of wool over his eyes that he can't really see through. And mostly it's because of his rage, you know, about things that he has been duped into believing. He is a product of his subculture, which he is deeply embedded in and cannot escape. And he's kind of beholden to saying these types of things too, because that's the expectation. I mean, if he were to actually come out and like make a reasonable argument about something, I mean, he'd be thrown out. So he's trapped, right? And this is what happens when you're in a cult. You know, you're not allowed to question yourself. So he's walking around on his two legs. I just wish he had a brain to go with it. Okay, hey, that's it. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.